Our first speaker will be Mark Danner, a journalist who's kept the issue of torture very much before the public in numerous articles and books. He'll speak today about From Anathema to Policy, Torture, Terror, and the American Way of Law. Mark Danner is Professor of Journalism, UC Berkeley, and James Clark Chase Professor of Foreign Affairs, Politics, and Humanity at Bard College. He's the author of Torture and Truth, and the book I'm reading right now, Stripping Bare the Body, Politics, Violence, and War. Please welcome Mark Danner.
Thank you. Thanks very much, Bill, for that kind introduction and the thought-provoking comments. And thank you to Professor Robert Cole for arranging this event today. I think it's very important that it take place here in Bolt Hall. And thank you especially to Dean Christopher Edley for being here to welcome us to this discussion. I appreciate it. I have been writing about torture and talking about it as well since well, about 20 years, but in the United States, that is torture as it regards the United States since 2004, and published a book that year, as Bill said, called Torture and Truth, which largely was made up of documents. 2/3 of it was government documents, including actually the memorandum, one of the memorandum that Bill mentioned, authored by Professor John Yoo. In fact, the last time I think I was in Bolt Hall was in 2005 during a debate with John Yoo. Fascinating occasion. And I suppose to begin with here, I have to say that I actually think the memoranda, not just those of John Yoo, but those that were put forward by the Department of Justice to replace them, by Dan Levin, Stephen Bradbury, and others, actually are absolutely central to this discussion. There is a sense that more than any other scandal, I don't know what else to call it, that one can point to in recent American history, that this particular scandal of torture revolves around lawyers. There's a particular reason for that, because, to put a long story short, and I'll be putting a lot of long stories short in the next 30 minutes, the CIA, when asked to interrogate by the Bush administration in certain harsh ways, to use EITs, otherwise known as enhanced interrogation techniques, immediately asked for a get out of jail free card, as Jack Goldsmith, the one-time head of the Office of Legal Counsel and now professor at Harvard, put it. That is, immediately, the CIA was concerned that what they were being asked to do would violate the law. And that, more especially, they were looking not only at the past, the 1970s, when various investigations into the CIA by the Church Commission, the Pike Commission, and others laid bare various wrongdoing, coup d'etats, assassinations, and so on, that they had undertaken in good faith, they believed, and that they were being persecuted for. And they were looking at the same time forward, I should say, to this very moment, to the moment we're sitting here and others have before them, judging the actions that they were asked to take and that they indeed did take. And I couldn't agree more at this point with Dean Edley that this is a hard question, very hard question, not an easy one. It's complicated. There is voluminous documentation of how these decisions were made, why the lawyers took the actions they did, why they wrote the memoranda they did, why they were asked to write it, and so on. But the fact remains that as we sit here, the way these events were, as it were, designed, and in particular the fact that you had the political authority, including President Bush, Vice President Cheney, and others, asking the CIA to do something which they in turn would not do without dispensation from the Department of Justice. That fact has put us in a peculiar position. The political leaders who made these decisions And this extends to President Bush, Vice President Cheney, Secretary of State at the time, the National Security Advisor Condoleezza Rice, Attorney General John Ashcroft, and Gonzalez and Mukasey who followed him. All of them have their fingerprints very much on this. Their names are in the documents. There's no question they knew about these interrogations as they were going on in great detail. There is no question that they were discussed in the White House. They can point to these memoranda and say, what we did was legal. At the same time, the interrogators can do precisely the same thing. They can point to these memoranda and say they were legal. Their actions were legal. So we are left in a rather strange position where the record continues to get filled in. We have a kind of jigsaw puzzle in front of us that is very, very clear now. There are a lot of documents that we don't have, but in essence, after the Inspector General's report from the CIA, after especially the Office of Professional Responsibility report from the Department of Justice, and many other documents, and including the memos themselves, although the most important one of those, I should be clear, was made public in 2004, a very long time ago. But after all these have been made public, we know what happened. We know how it happened. We know in detail what happened in the black sites. But as we have passed from one administration to the other, as leadership has passed from one party to the other, there has been no action to do anything about it. I want to read a quotation, an eloquent quotation from President Obama. This comes from his Nobel Prize acceptance speech in December of last year. He said, "To begin with, I believe that all nations, strong and weak alike, must adhere to standards that govern the use of force. I, like any head of state, reserve the right to act unilaterally if necessary to defend my nation." You remember at the time he gave this talk, he was escalating the number of troops in Afghanistan. "Nevertheless, I'm convinced that adhering to standards strengthens those who do and isolates and weakens those who don't. Where force is necessary, we have a moral and strategic interest in binding ourselves to certain rules of conduct. And even as we confront a vicious adversary that abides by no rules, I believe that the United States of America must remain a standard bearer in the conduct of war. That is what makes us different from those whom we fight. That is a source of strength. That is why I prohibited torture. That is why I ordered the prison at Guantanamo Bay closed. That is why I've reaffirmed America's commitment to abide by the Geneva Conventions. We lose ourselves when we compromise the very ideals that we fight to defend. We honor those ideals by upholding them not just when it is easy, but when it is hard." Now, these, it strikes me, are very eloquent words, and they're very welcome. They contrast quite dramatically with the attitude of the Bush administration when it came to international law. The Bush administration's attitude, again, complicated, hard issue, but I can't resist reading a sentence from their national security strategy of 2005, which I think encapsulates a very different attitude. "Nations will continue to challenge us, employing the weapons of the weak, including international fora, judicial processes, and terrorism." I want to cite that trio of things again. International fora, judicial processes, and terrorism. In this you have international law, multilateral institutions, and so on placed together with terrorism as weapons that weaker states deploy and use, which is to say that international law has the downside, very substantial, of limiting the power of the strongest state, and therefore is to be denigrated and used whenever necessary and discarded when not by that powerful state.